Saili was born and schooled in Mussoorie. He taught English in a postgraduate college. Folks say what he doesn't know about Mussoorie isn't worth knowing. His books are a record of the goings-on in the pleasure capital of the Raj. Having grown up in the hills from an impressionable age, he has trekked the high mountains, recording in words and pictures the magic of the mountains. His work has been published widely and translated into about 24 languages. His latest book, Wanderings in the Garhwal Himalaya, takes the reader to the hills in a clutch of 22 essays and 200 pictures. There are several other books that he has written, and many accolades have come his way. In 1994, his tale of travel to the mystery lake of Rupkund won the Panorama Film Festival Award in Houston. He won the Sangeet Trophy in 95 and the National Award in 96. To briefly introduce Stephen Alder, he's the author of about 20 books of fiction and non-fiction. Again, he was born in Mussoorie and much of his writing is focused on the Himalayan region, where he continues to live and work. His debut novel, Neglected Lives, was brought out in 1978, and it was described by the New Yorker as a short novel of unusual and exquisite quality. He has written widely and received several awards, including being shortlisted for the 2017 BSc South Asian Literature Award for his collection In the Jungles of the Night, a novel about Jim Corbett. The Cloud Farers is his most recent book for young readers. He's also written extensively on natural history, folklore and mountain culture, particularly in his travel memoir, Sacred Waters, a pilgrimage to the many sources of the Ganga, which describes a journey on foot along the pilgrim trails of the Uttarakhand Chardham Yatra. He is the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Fulbright Program, the East-West Center in Hawaii, and the Banff Center for Mountain Culture. Over to both of you.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here, and thank you all for coming here this afternoon, and my special thanks to the organizers for making us so comfortable and so welcome. Ganesh and I are neighbors and friends in Mussoorie. We've come all the way to Goa to sit down together. And I think that it might be helpful at the outset for each of us to describe our journeys to Mussoorie, where we came from, where we landed, and how we landed there. In Ganesh's recent book, Wanderings in the Garhwal Himalaya, he has a very moving passage in which he writes about his father traveling to Mussoorie. And I think perhaps, Ganesh, if you could start by telling that story and then giving a sense of how did you get here and what is it that holds you in Mussoorie?
About 100 years ago, this exodus, this male exodus from the mountains has been happening. I mean, it's been happening since times, people looking for work. Life is tough in the villages, there's nothing for the young people to do, and my father was part of that, those males who have to come out into the plains. My father, when I think of my father now, I see this 15-year-old boy getting away from his village, heading out without a clue as to where he's going. He arrives at the then bus head at Rishikesh. He looks at the fare chart. He didn't have too much money on him either. And the cheapest fare from Rishikesh was to Mussoorie. So that's about all he could afford, thank God. And he ends up in Mussoorie, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is the beginning of my family in Mussoorie. He came up there, didn't have a clue of what he was going to do, but then he found his landed feet straight up, worked very hard, and this more or less is the story of all of us who come out of the bulldogs of Garhwal. We begin, otherwise the only options you have is joined the various paramilitary forces, the army. The district that I come from, it borders China. And we have what is infamously called the money order economy. It's almost 5 crores a month end up in from soldiers sending their salaries home, from the Ladakh Scouts to the BSA, armed forces, paramilitary. My father didn't join that, but he found his way through Mussoorie, and I just was born in Mussoorie, schooled in Mussoorie, finished my college there, and a month later, I hung on like a limpet, didn't refuse to leave, and no regrets. Had a nice life up there.
Thank you, Ganesh. And it's interesting that the parallels. My arrival in Mussoorie, or rather my forefathers' arrival in Mussoorie, goes back to 1916, when my grandparents came from the United States as American missionaries, and they came to Landauer, to Mussoorie, to study Hindi. And then our family association with Landauer continued. My grandfather returned and became the principal of Woodstock School, which is a school that my father attended and I also attended. My father was born in India and came back to Mussoorie after his education in the United States. And I was then born in Mussoorie myself. So we have 3-4 generations in Mussoorie. We also came from somewhere else. And this, I think, is one of the interesting things about the Himalaya. I've been working on a book about the natural history of the Himalaya. And one of the things that I think cuts across every culture, every town, every settlement in the Himalaya is that everybody realizes that they came from somewhere else. They may not remember where their ancestors came from, but there's very definitely a sense that we came from somewhere else. It may be from Tibet, crossing over the mountains and settling in some of the transverse valleys, whether it's the Sherpas of Nepal, whether it's people in Gilgit, Baltistan, it's somewhere else. And the stories evoke a resonance in many, many different narratives. The mythology of the Mahabharata, the Pandav Lila that gets performed in Garhwal, the idea of exile in the forest, people associate with that. People trace their ancestry, in a sense, to those mythological narratives that have brought them there. And so that when the Pandav Lila is performed in Garhwal, people are observing, participating in a sense, their own origin stories there. So all of us who are in the Himalayas came from somewhere else, even if we don't remember where it is. Now, to go back to Mussoorie for a few minutes, we'll broaden the discussion a little bit in a few moments, but I think it would be very helpful if Ganesh could give you a sense of Mussourie's literary heritage. For better or worse, people often think of Mussoorie as a place where writers hang out. The truth is, we don't hang out that much, and we don't necessarily talk about literature. We gossip about each other, perhaps. But it has acquired a literary reputation, partly because of Ruskin Bond's presence there. But Ganesh has researched this, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the literary history of Mussoorie and why this town has this writing culture in it.
I think we are a mile up in the sky. I have my own, Ruskin and I have our own theory on that one, and that is that living up there, living up there can, lack of oxygen, I think, does a bit of brain damage, and we all end up there, all of us. It's just amazing. It goes back to 1834. The town came up in about around 1827, and by 1834, the earliest records of Mussoorie, Ruskin and I looked hard, really worked, because that's what we write about. And we then found these letters from Mogamonk, who was a teacher, 21-year-old teacher in the first school in Mussoorie, called the Mussoorie Seminary. And he records, he was quite a flop, the guy, Steve always tells me, the guy is such a loser. But he was such a loser. His story is so interesting. You know, usually those stories can be very tedious, but he noted down every little thing. And in his letters to his family in England as a 21-year-old, he is writing home to his father, to his uncles, to his sisters, to his cousins, really writing way in, you know, in longhand, using up the side of the paper, writing all around it, and we got these letters, you know, this book, and that is the earliest record. And for some reason, then you have someone like John Lang. John Lang was an Australian-born author who, again, he was quite a maverick, John Lang. He ran into trouble in Australia, of all places, and left Australia. Came to Mussoorie in the 1850s. He was in Mussoorie. He was a lawyer. He was a writer. He didn't do photography at that point. He did everything else. I mean, photography didn't exist. And he was always running afoul of the authorities. He defended the Rani of Jhansi. He was a lawyer, and it is the only living description in the English language that I know of the Rani of Jhansi, the way she looked, the way she was. You know, the rest are a lot of glorified accounts, but his is a very lawyer's thing. He saw her through a parda, and that was John Lang writing about her, and Lang wrote a lot of stuff. So I think Mussoorie, layer after layer, I am staggered at the amount of stuff that keeps revealing itself to those who look. And that is one of the reasons I think there are so many of us out there, Steve, is that, you know, it just keeps, look at you. I mean, the amount of stuff you've written is staggering. And, you know, I just keep finding out more and more and more, and it reveals itself. And there are a lot of writers, as Steve said. I keep teasing them. I said, you guys are writers, I'm just an old typewriter. And, you know, keep going. But I keep discovering stuff on Mussoorie every week, believe you me. You just find new stuff that nobody's ever written about. People have missed out. It's fallen through the floor. And, you know, you keep it going, I think.
One of the things that I often reflect on is that living in Mussoorie, being at about 2,500 feet above, 2,500 meters above sea level, is that writers at that altitude, it's lack of oxygen perhaps, but we also have a different perspective on the world, a different perspective on the landscape because of our elevation. Here in Goa, I'm sure that writers on one hand look out to the sea, on the other hand they look inward to the land, the forest, the carts behind. We in Landauer are up at a certain height, so that when we look southward, we look out over the Gangetic Plain. It gives us that broad, expansive perspective that's there. And yet when we turn around, we're looking at the high Himalaya behind us, going up to 7,000 meters and higher. And there's that sort of, that perspective that takes us deeper into the mountains, more, in some ways, it's certainly a broad panorama, but there's also an internal perspective. Thank you. No, and Barley Wilson, or by whatever name he's known, is a fascinating character because he basically clear-felled much of the Bhagirathi Valley, as you were saying.
Yeah.
And it was one of the first points at which the British administrators realized that they had to do something for conservation. And the British basically didn't have a forestry department, so they turned to the Germans. They brought in Dieter Brandy and others to try and figure out how do we manage these resources that we are there. And that, of course, then led to the Forest Service, the laws that were enacted, and so on and so forth. But as you were saying, one of the things about the Himalaya is that it's, as a subject, we're very fortunate to choose the Himalaya as our subject because it's a limitless, we speak about oceans of story. I like to think of it as glaciers of story. These glaciers, which again are migrating and moving constantly. And my own sense is that the Himalayan narratives move just stories travel too. Stories travel from one point to another, and often I found folklore that I'm listening to in one part of the Himalaya is then retold in a different form somewhere else. As a writer, I find that when I'm writing about the Himalaya, I must travel. I must travel. And I often say that I write with my feet, because many of my books were written after I completed a certain journey. Usually I travel on foot. Often I travel alone on foot through the mountains. And I think of those journeys as being the first draft of the books I write. Because as I'm going along, I'm very aware of the stories that I'm going to tell when I come home. And so I make choices. If I climb that hill, perhaps it will be a better story than if I go down into the valley. If I take the path to the left rather than the path to the right, there's more possibility that I can tie the stories in with something that I've encountered before. And of course, if I get lost, then I get the best stories of all. If you lose your way, you are definitely going to find something worth writing about. And the Himalayas offer us this wonderful landscape in which we can travel to different destinations, but also travel along different routes that others have followed before. I was speaking with one of India's premier climbers, Chandraprabha Aidwal, who lives in Uttarakhand. Now she, as a young woman, grew up in a migrant community along the borders of India and Nepal, the Yasi Shoka tribe there. And so as a young girl, she was traveling with her goats and sheep from near Pithoragarh up to the border with Tibet, and then across to Taklakot with her father. And she grew up that way, that she was educated, became a teacher, and she only joined mountaineering when she was about 35. She said, up until that time I had no interest in climbing a mountain. But she put her name in for the Nehru Institute of Mountaineering and did the course, and she found she was very good at it. Now, here's a person who is from the heart of the Himalaya. Her whole identity is associated with these migratory routes. She's not from one point. She's not even from point A and point B, which are the two endpoints of her migration. She's actually from, if you asked her, where are you from? She's from that itinerary that she followed. Each of the halts along that way are places that she knows. And so her identity is a journey. It's not a place necessarily. A very strong sense of place, but it's not a specific spot on the map. And then it's fascinating to see how she, as a mountaineer, evolved and began to climb various peaks. She joined international expeditions. She was on the first group to climb the first group of women to climb Nanda Devi, and became a very eminent mountaineer. Now, it was natural for her to become a mountaineer, but she'd never thought of it before. And yet here her life is transformed through this adventure travel, adventure experiences of mountaineering, which essentially is a modern European narrative that came to the Himalayas from the Alps. And yet Chandraprabha herself latched onto that, was good at it, and certainly made a name for herself through those journeys. So those journeys, those travels that we take throughout the Himalayas, in a sense are a part of our identity, but they are also part of the stories that we tell. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think